Hi everyone, it's Moumita. Thank you for joining me today for Coffee with Moumita. Today I was having a really kind of a lively discussion with one of my current clients who has just completed their marriage-based green card interview. And we were talking, he asked me, well, what is this thing that you do every week, Moumita? And I said, I give a little bit of an update on immigration news and updates. And you know what? Your case would be fascinating to talk about. So today, what I'm going to talk about is what happens at your marriage-based green card interview and what happens if things go wrong. So there are a lot of things that can happen. I meet a lot of clients throughout the course of my work, some who come to me from the beginning, some who come to me, when perhaps their interview has been scheduled, some who come to me after they've already had their interview and something has gone wrong. And, the process with USCIS can be a very frustrating ordeal. Sometimes some people's cases go smoothly with no issues whatsoever. Other times, some people will have certain complications in their cases, and those complications might arise during the interview or after the interview. And other times, some people have no problems whatsoever in their case, and something kind of hits the client out of the blue, and they might, get a request for evidence, or they might be asked to come in for a second interview. So today I want to discuss with you what can go wrong during a green card interview. Well, a lot of things can go wrong, unfortunately. So one thing that some people commonly post about is, should I even bring a lawyer with me to the interview? And my answer is yes, absolutely. You should always have a lawyer with you for the entire process. But if you can't afford a lawyer, or you just, you try to do it by yourself and you realize later that perhaps it's a good idea to have a lawyer, you definitely need to have a lawyer with you at the interview. People might ask, what can go wrong? Why, my marriage is real. Why should I bring a lawyer with me? Won't that make me look bad? Would it make it look like to the officer that I'm lying and that I'm there to protect myself from getting caught? And I say, absolutely not. It's your right to have legal representation. And second, the lawyer is there. We're not there to answer questions on your behalf, because the interview that you have really is about your and your spouse's testimony about your relationship and about your eligibility to even receive a green card. So I can't answer on your behalf, but I'm there to not just observe, but I'm there to make sure things don't go wrong. The officer doesn't confuse documents, and that the officer doesn't confuse the law, because a lot of times most of our officers are trained very well, but sometimes they might make a mistake, they might make an error, they might insist that the client has to show something, perhaps an I-94 card or a stamp, when perhaps you're not even really required to get one. And the other really important thing is that sometimes officers will not treat you that well. They might treat you with outright hostility from the beginning, and it's my job as your lawyer to make sure that I prevent the officer from behaving in a manner that is out of hand. Sometimes I might have to tell the officer to tone it down, or I might have to ask the officer for a supervisor because their behavior is just so completely crazy. I'll give you an example. I had an interview about 2-3 weeks ago where my clients have a kind of an unusual living arrangement. They both don't live in the same state. They have other various factors that might seem a little bit suspicious to other people. And from the very moment that we sat down at the interview, the officer was really, really aggressive, and she was practically yelling at my clients for no reason. And I actually had to tell her, I just stepped out of an interview right before coming into this, and the officer did not treat us this way, and you're badgering my client, and you need to stop. And surprisingly, she did. Now, maybe a statement like that might make an officer upset, but you know what? It's my duty as your lawyer to make sure that the officer doesn't abuse their power. So that's actually a really good segue into another reason why you should always have a lawyer with you at the interview, because I always hear a lot of stories from people who've had the interview by themselves, and they didn't have a lawyer with them, and they come back to me with some really crazy things that the officer says. And yes, the marriage interview, it is an interview where the officer is looking to find cracks in your story, to find out if your marriage is real or if it's not. So yes, from the outset, they might be treating you with a lot of suspicion. But some officers also take advantage of the situation, and they might make prejudice statements to you or comments about your race or nationality that are just completely inappropriate. So, if sometimes the mere fact that you have a lawyer in the room with you will actually prevent them from treating you in a disparaging manner. So, should you have a lawyer with you at your green card interview? Absolutely. You should also have a lawyer with you during any time that you're in front of a judge or in front of an immigration officer, perhaps for your citizenship interview, because a lot of things can go wrong, and maybe we'll do another video on citizenship interviews another time. So what else can happen? Let's say you go through your interview and you and your spouse are there, everything looks great, you have tons of documents to prove that your marriage is bona fide, you're answering every single question correct, and you remember all of your dates, remember all of your important life events. What can happen after that? Well, ideally, within a week, 2 weeks after the interview, we get an approval notice and we get a notification that your card is being approved. But every once in a while, we might get something called a request for evidence. And a request for evidence is simply just a request asking you for documentation that the officer needs in order to make a complete decision on your case. A lot of times, you might get a request for evidence during the interview, or you might even get a request for evidence in the mail after, when you have no reason to believe that you'll receive a request for evidence. So I'll give you 2 examples of a request for evidence. Actually, I'll give you 3. So one might be, let's say you go for your interview and you filed your case a long time ago. Now in New York City, for our New York field office itself, it's taking more, almost a year and a half or more just to get an interview scheduled for your case. So by that time, you might find out that your medical exam that you submitted at the beginning of the process has expired. Ideally, you want to know this beforehand and bring in an updated medical exam with you. And sometimes the officer, they send you a letter before your interview reminding you to bring in an updated medical exam, but most of the time they don't. So sometimes you might be surprised to find out during your interview that your medical exam is no longer up to date, and you have to go back to the doctor and pay hundreds more dollars to get your blood tested and perhaps some more shots and whatever else it is that they want to do. So the officer might issue you a request for evidence to come in and bring a new medical exam. The other thing that they might ask you for during your interview is, let's say you have a criminal history, and you don't have a certificate of disposition or something official that shows the final outcome of your case. If you don't have that with you during your interview, then the officer will most definitely issue a request for evidence for you to bring it in. Now, I'm going to give you an example of something, sometimes the requests that you might get really make no sense at all. And I'll give you an example of something that happened in one of my cases a few weeks ago. I have a client who, had changed his name, and already from the beginning, I knew that this was going to be an issue and that we had to provide, documents to show how person A is now known as person B. So, before we even started the case, I asked him to go get letters or documentation showing his name change, and we submitted this name change documentation when we first filed, and we also brought it with us to the interview. And I told the officer, in here you'll find the name change document. And everything went great at the interview. The officer seemed to love my clients, and she was really great and friendly. And I asked her at the end, what do you think? Do you have any issues? Do you need anything else? And she said, no, everything looks fine. But lo and behold, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks later, we got a request for evidence asking us to show proof that person A is now the same person as person B. That Adam, who changed his name to Kevin, is now Kevin. So, I thought it was a ridiculous request for evidence because clearly we had already submitted the evidence and we had brought the documents with us to the interview. We told the officer that we brought it too, but we got this request. And sometimes it happens. I have two theories about this. One is that perhaps the officer herself, could not have made a decision at the time of the interview, and she gave it to another officer who didn't look at the documents closely. And my other theory is that sometimes the officers have a quota as to, maybe they're not supposed to make a decision right away, or maybe they're approving too many cases, so they have to send out some occasional requests for evidence. Whatever it was a little bit frustrating to deal with because it caused my client to miss out on some important travel he had for a friend's wedding. But, we got the request in, we had to respond to it even though it was their mistake, and, my client got approved, but it unfortunately caused a delay. So I have a question here from Moaz. I'm going to answer it in a second. Okay, so that's one thing that can happen. Now, another thing that can happen after your green card interview is, like I said before, the whole purpose of a green card interview based on marriage is to determine whether your marriage is real. And, fortunately, there are lots of great couples that go through this process. Their marriages are real. And every once in a while, perhaps there's a couple that's not doing it for the right reasons. So if the officer does not believe that your marriage is real, then they will ask you to come back for a second interview. We call this a Stokes interview, and a Stokes interview is actually based on a case that went through the courts called Stokes versus INS. And a Stokes interview is basically a second interview that you might get called back for, where the couple will actually get separated, and each person gets asked exactly the same questions. And neither your spouse might be asked how many siblings does your wife have, and you won't know that your husband was asked that, and they also won't know how you answer as well. So not only will you be separated, you'll both be asked the same questions, and your answers will be recorded, and they'll be compared at the end. So if your answers differ at all, then the officer will ask you, at the end when they bring you both back in together, why did your answers vary? So if you have too many discrepancies, that's not a good news. Sometimes you can explain a discrepancy. Maybe it was a language difficulty, or you didn't understand the question, or perhaps you were confused. However, if you have more than a few, then it might spell trouble for you. So this is another type of interview that I'll get a lot, where people come to me after they've done this process by themselves, or they've done it with a different attorney, and they get a request for Stokes interview, and I spend tons of time preparing them. I do mock interviews. I go over potential question variations, because even though we kind of have an idea of what sort of questions the officer might ask, everyone's questions are always different because everyone's life is different and everyone's facts are different. So it's really important to have a lawyer with you to prepare you and to attend the interview with you, because when I'm there at a Stokes interview, you'll see me writing furiously because I'm writing down every single question the officer asked. I'm writing down as fast as I can how my client is answering, because at the end, when both parties get brought back in together, and the officer is asking questions, I have an opportunity to also ask questions to clarify their answers. And I also have to create a record so that if USCIS decides to deny the green card application, I can rebut it. So anyway, that's another really important reason to have a lawyer. And unfortunately, sometimes clients get called in for a Stokes interview even when everything seemed to go well, when there should have been no problems at all. In one case that I had where my clients had a pretty significant age difference, they got called in for a Stokes interview. Even though everything they answered was perfect, we had all the documents, the marriage was real, but the officers, unfortunately seemed to be prejudiced against the age discrepancy, where my female client was older than the husband by a number of years. So, in my belief, that's really the only reason that triggered the interview. Fortunately, we went through with the Stokes, everything was fine. Okay, I'm gonna just answer some questions. I have a question here from Moaz. So Moaz, you are asking what is going on InfoPass appointment? New York and Long Island office are no longer accepting walk-ins and giving appointments. Yes, this is true. So for those of you that don't know what an InfoPass appointment is basically the appointment system where you can make an appointment with USCIS to go visit your field office and talk to an immigration officer about your case. Sometimes it's useful when you are experiencing a significant delay in your case and you want to find out what's going on, or you need to make an emergency request for advance parole, or you need to get a stamp in your passport. So the way that InfoPass normally works is you would usually go online, choose your field office, and then see what appointments are available. And this created a big problem because InfoPass appointments are generally released just 2 weeks at a time, and just a small number of them. And if you didn't go online, maybe at 6 a.m. or sometimes at midnight to see what was available, all the appointments would be gone by the time it's during a normal business hour. So that's a huge problem that we had with InfoPass anyway. There were certain instances where we did not need InfoPass appointment. For example, if you have a death in the family and you needed to travel overseas and you needed to get advance parole, you could actually walk in and make an emergency request. However, as of the past few months, that's been taken away altogether. So we no longer have any online appointment system available to make InfoPass appointments. And second, you can no longer walk in to make emergency requests for anything. And what you have to do now is you actually have to call the USCIS customer service number. It's 1-800-375-5283 or something like that. Just make sure you double check online. You have to call them up and you actually have to request an appointment. And the very annoying and aggravating thing is that you're not going to get an appointment right away. You actually have to wait for them to call you back. And generally what I find is that when the person, like let's say if you have an application, you want to make an appointment, if you call by yourself, then normally you'll get a call back within a day or two. If your attorney calls for you, normally they're calling us back like 3 days later. And they're also almost always calling back after regular business hours. So maybe like 8 o'clock at night when I'm no longer here in the office, or maybe I'm in transit. So if you miss that phone call, you have to call them back and request another appointment and wait for that whole system, because it's really unlikely that you're going to call the customer service line and get an appointment right away. You have to wait for them to call you back. And whenever they call you back, you just have to make sure you take whatever appointment they have available, even though it's going to be 1 to 2 weeks out. Sometimes if you have a real emergency, for example, like you really do have a family member that's passed away or that's gravely ill and you really need to go see them, you can try to escalate your call to a level, tier 2 or tier 3 officer and try to get an appointment even faster. But it's pretty difficult. But anyway, so if you need to make an InfoPass appointment, you have to call up USCIS, and they have phased out walk-in appointments and online scheduling for New York and a couple of the other big fields offices. And they will soon be phasing it out completely for all USCIS offices. And the word is that they'll get rid of InfoPass by, I think, like October or September of this year. So get ready. It's just another invisible brick in the wall, that makes life a lot more difficult for persons that are trying to get benefits through USCIS. So that is my bit on InfoPass. And yeah, if anyone has any more questions, let me know. Again, I just want to reiterate, you really want to have a good, experienced immigration lawyer with you for your interview, whether it's for a green card or whether it's for citizenship, because some problems can arise no matter what. And my job, I try to make things as smooth and as pain-free for clients as possible, but just keep in mind that we're dealing, every single case has an officer assigned to it, and each officer has certain thoughts and they have certain things that they're willing to accept and certain documents that they insist on. I try to predict as much as I can, and I try to anticipate what they're going to ask for, but every once in a while the officer might ask for something that we're totally not expecting. So you definitely want to have an attorney help you with any request for evidence as well. One more thing that I can tell you about request for evidence here in the New York Fields office is that we actually have a new system for turning in requests for evidence. It's perhaps not that new anymore. It's been going on for about a year. But when you get a request for evidence in either the Brooklyn or the New York Fields office, they actually give you a date where you have to come back and hand in the request in person. This is actually not that bad because it makes sure that your request for evidence actually doesn't get lost when it hits the mailroom. It instead gets placed in your folder right away. However, it means that you'll have to wait another month, sometimes 2 months, to actually turn in your response, which is another delay in the case. Anyway, I hope you guys found this very, very useful. If you have more questions or any topics that you'd like me to cover next week, please let me know. And until then, I wish everybody a great week and take care. This video is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. For proper legal advice on your case, please call us to set up a consultation.